Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to everyone on the line. We're just going to give a couple minutes so that everyone can join the webinar before we get started.
Sorry, is my webcam on? No.
No, I don't see your webcam on.
Probably, given people's bandwidth and stuff, it may be best if I leave it off. What do you think? It's probably, well, I will share my webcam. Yeah, I really haven't used this in a long time. I can share my webcam. My
Sure.
experience in the past has been when you get lots of people on, things start to get a little clunky. And,
Okay, but you could try sharing your webcam, and if things aren't working out, you can always turn it off again.
That's right.
Okay. Well, hello again and welcome to everyone. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the first in a series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Awareness Week. Today, we are very lucky to be having a talk on wild pigs presented by Dr. Ryan Brook. Dr. Ryan Brook is an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan. His presentation will focus on the brief history of the establishment of free-ranging wild pigs in Canada and specific implications and risks to the Northwest Territories. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Ryan, and you can begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much for the invite to talk today. This is a near and dear topic to my heart. I've been working on wild pigs for just a little over 11 years now. So this has been a labor of love, if not one of deep frustration. But thanks so much for the invite. I also want to thank Nini Jutha and Rob Dow, who I've been working with and talking about specifically issues around the NWT recently. And been working to help them a little bit with understanding some of these risks and identifying some monitoring pathways forward to understand what could and should be done to keep them out. NWT is in the enviable position of being wild pig free, as far as everybody can tell, and I think we're very safe in saying that there are no wild pigs in the Northwest Territories. And so coming here from Saskatchewan, which is home for me, is literally the opposite. Saskatchewan is by far and away the worst place in Canada for wild pigs, and we have an area in east central Saskatchewan that has, probably the large majority of pigs in Canada are actually in that area. So, of all of the occurrences, more than half are in Saskatchewan. So we have a worst case scenario, and we have in a lot of ways, I think, a good case scenario. Risk is often defined as probability of occurrence times the impact. And so while the probability right now today is quite low and it's not necessarily a huge concern today, the risk or the potential of it occurring is not zero, and the implications are huge. And we know that wild pigs are these really incredibly destructive, and indeed, I would argue, and many other experts have argued, that wild pigs are the worst invasive large mammal on the planet. And for a whole bunch of reasons we'll get into. So if you want to learn more, you could check us out our Facebook page and follow us and look to see the research we're doing. I tweet pretty regularly about pigs and occurrences and various things around that. So follow us there, and certainly email me if you have questions or want to follow up. But I really want to talk, I'm going to talk today first about sort of the big picture, and then we'll zoom in down and talk more specifically about the NWT. And of course, I think we're quite well placed. Hopefully, if I don't ramble on as I do, we'll have quite a bit of time for questions after as well. So again, thanks everybody for popping in. Hopefully, you're eating your lunch as we proceed. I somehow am not going to be able to eat and talk at the same time. There we go. So where does this all start? In the 1980s, sorry, to back up, there are no native pigs to Canada. And so this is quite a unique scenario, and that these were brought in the 1980s. And there was a big push in Canada to diversify agriculture through the 80s and into the 90s. And this idea that you just couldn't survive, or at least agriculture to be successful, needed to diversify. And so we saw elk ranches, we saw emu farms, we saw some people raising reindeer, a couple of people tried to raise moose farms. I mean, you name it. Diversification was the game back in those days, and there was a lot of resources and support actually to make that happen. And indeed, Canada invested a lot of money in this wild boar issue. And so in the 1980s, these wild boar were brought over from Europe, domestic animals to be raised on farms, primarily from meat farms, but also in a few provinces to establish what we call a high fence shoot operation. So you can go and quote unquote hunt an animal inside a fenced compound. And those still exist today, as do the meat farms. Unfortunately, there were escapes, and lots of them. Trying to keep these things inside a fence is difficult because they dig really well. They're incredibly tough, and I've seen them scoot over a 6-foot fence with barely breaking a stride. And so it's actually quite unbelievable. I often laugh at the Simpsons movie. If you've seen it, Homer has a spider pig line in there, and with tracks on the ceiling. And of course, we sort of laugh at that because they really are sort of spider pigs in their ability to get in and over and under and through things. And so there were a lot of escapes, but more frustrating that really when the market kind of fell apart for these things and never really established fully, what a lot of people did was actually cut the fence and let them go. And that was very widespread. And we've documented many cases of that across Canada, especially on the prairies, but elsewhere as well. And what happened here is this is actually we have probably the best data we have historically on the domestic side was that they were listed as part of the Ag Census of Canada. And so in 2001, here's a map of what Canada looked like at a core census block level, but we had widespread farms, in many cases over 30 farms in some of these blocks, especially, and perhaps most importantly, for the purposes of this discussion, NWT, one of the two black blocks in the very northern part of Alberta were among the highest, the 3 highest places with the most farms in Canada. And so that is one of the first red flag I'll raise as a big one. And so, we had 500 farms with 32,000 animals, according to Stats Canada. Probably more because there's lots of, these were never really properly licensed. They were never, at least not on the Canadian prairies. It was really, I always call them effectively operated like rogue nations. These farms were sort of, someone would just buy a bred sow and maybe a boar and a couple other animals and put them in a fence. And we even see that today, where there are some commercial, there's a place called the Foam Lake, Saskatchewan, where they have this commercial operation and they produce meat, and you can buy, quite nice ribs and these sorts of things. And that's a reasonably well-run operation. And then there were fly-by-night people that had no understanding of agriculture. And so we have and continue to see a range of types of operations, but of course, as I say, all of them at least slightly leaky as far as we could tell. And so this set the basis. This is where we got to in 2001, and then after that it crashed to the point now where the most recent census of Canada does not even record wild boar specifically on farms. It's listed as other exotics. And so we don't even have good data on how many farms there are left. So that was sort of where we started from. This is the history. I mean, it's not that, it was only 20 years ago, really, when we hit this peak. So it is quite a recent history, whereas in the US, the pigs were brought over by, Spanish explorers, and so there's like a 400 or 500 year history of wild boar, and they're well established as free-ranging wild pigs in the southern U.S. Texas, Florida, California have almost 100% coverage. And so what is a wild pig then? Wild pig is, I discourage the use of wild boar, and we don't use it in the wild sense, because most of the animals, the overwhelming majority of animals that you might see in the wild in Canada, in fact, are much more complex than wild boar, and indeed are not pure wild boar. Very, very few, and indeed none of the animals we've sampled for genetics have 100% wild boar. Some are close, but many are below 50% wild boar. And so what happened when they were brought over, some of the experts said, well, if you want big animals with large bodies, high reproductive rates, cross them with a domestic pig. So the overwhelming majority of animals inside a fence in Canada right now are some kind of hybrids, and those outside of the fence include occasionally there may be some true wild boar that escape. Some of the high fence shoot operations brag about having true wild boar. That may or may not be the case, but here we are. Some kind of domestic wild pig hybrid. And indeed, occasionally here in Saskatchewan, we do see some abandoned domestic pig herds as well. Not many, but there have been a few around. And those pigs have no wild boar genetics of any kind. And then more recently, we're seeing pot-bellied pigs. And one of the things I've been looking at in detail, I'm going to write a short paper on this right away, is that we're seeing lots of pigs for sale on the Canadian prairies, into BC, Ontario, and even in the East Coast, where you can buy, and as many know who've used Kijiji, this is cash and carry, no records, no nothing, just show up with your truck, and you can buy various wild boar crosses with domestic pig, wild boar cross with pot-bellied pigs, or certainly dozens and dozens of options for obtaining pot-bellied pigs. And that's not even to mention the pet trade, which is probably the #1 source of pot-bellied pigs. And what happens with pot-bellies is people buy these so-called teacup pigs, and you fit them in your purse, and they're cute, and you can carry them around. But a lot of them are actually full-bodied pot-bellies and get to be 130, 150 plus pounds, and then people just dump them out in the country. So we have this whole mix, and this trail cam image on the left here kind of highlights. You'll see two animals in the front look very much like Eurasian wild boar, and then you see some pink domestic pigs that have their Yorkshire pigs with no wild boar in them whatsoever. In the back, you see that spotted hybrid animal. And on the right, you see the whole color range from these kind of gray-brown animals to various spotted pigs, many of which have large patches of pink skin as well from the hybridization. We see some jet black ones. So a whole range of things, and that is why we use the term wild pig. That's the broad generic catch-all for everything. So to call probably any of these animals in these photos wild boar would be incorrect, and certainly from a policy perspective would be a grave mistake to say wild boar, because in fact you may end up in a court or a situation where that would be challenged and say, well, we ran a genetic test and this pig has no wild boar genetics of any kind, or minimally so. And so what Ontario has done, I think, in their more recent work, is just said any free-ranging suid from the family Suidae, just to catch all. But certainly wild pigs is the generic one. And one of the primary factors, there are a number of them that make them the most successful and most dangerous invasive large mammal on the planet. But this super high reproductive rate is one of their big signature moves. And here on the Canadian prairies, we see 6 young per litter, 2 litters per year. It's only 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days for gestation, right? So very, very short period, and they have young. And the second, probably most important one, is all of these striped young. This is already 2018, so these things all those young have produced all sorts of young of their own. And usually 4 to 6 months, these young striped piglets will become reproductively active on their own and start producing their own. And usually that lines up with the loss of those horizontal cream-colored stripes you see here. They're already starting to fade a bit. these animals are probably on the order of 2.5 to 3 months old. And so they're not that far from being bigger animals and being reproductively capable themselves. And so that just, you take one bred sow, so you go to Kijiji, you buy $200, you buy a bred sow and dump it somewhere in the wild, and that can turn into 100 pigs very, very quickly. And of course, wild pigs are sort of one of those love the one you're with kind of species, so they don't have any problem breeding with their own family. And so we see a very, very rapid expansion. My dog is sleeping and she's having some sort of dream. So if you hear some whimpering in background, I'm not standing on my dog. She's just having some sort of dream, running, chasing some rabbits somewhere. She's quite loud, making me chuckle. So this is the situation we're looking at here. And I think before COVID, I used to devote a bit of time to explaining exponential growth. But it turns out now everybody's had a crash course on it and understands what exponential growth looks like from our COVID scenario. But these are occurrences of pigs. And so we've been tracking this. We started work on 2010, but we've done lots of interviews and talked to many, many hundreds of people about their sightings previous. And there really wasn't a whole lot. And this is consistent, of course, that, in 1995, when the first free-ranging pig was observed that we know of from our database, that's about the time that farming had really ramped up and they started to escape. And so this is kind of consistent with what we've seen around the timeline of establishment of farms. And that's really the only option. The other potential is that they came up from the US. But back in the 90s, there were no wild pigs to speak of. Really, the northern US really didn't have an issue. And even today, there aren't that many in most of these northern states. They've actually done quite a good job of eradicating or preventing them. And so really the only option is that they came from these farms. And like a lot of these populations, it takes a bit of time to get established and expand. But once you start to see those litters dropping, and during the course of this talk right now, there's no question in my mind that there are pigs out there in Canada dropping litters literally as I'm talking. They're squeezing out babies, and they're indeed doing that year round. So which is also part of their success story, is they don't have a reproductive season like your native elk, moose, deer, these sorts of things. There's this narrow window and they all give birth. That's basically starting probably about now right here in Saskatchewan. I suspect our moose have probably dropped. The first few calves have already been born in the last couple of days. So we're sort of just starting into the traditional ungulate reproductive season. And but of course pigs, they just keep going and going and going. And those occurrences have increased exponentially in the last 3 years. Have been really particularly alarming. And I will say that, so this is work that my PhD student Ruth Asham and I did. This is the first publication of her PhD. But when she started as a master's student. And I actually said, I'm not sure there's enough wild pig occurrences across Canada to do this kind of work. So we have to have a backup plan. Well, the more we dug and the more she interviewed people and collected trail camera images, and we used 10 different methods: media search, GPS collars. We ran our trail cameras. We collected probably on the order of 2,000 or 3,000 trail camera photos from landowners, sightings from experts. So Ruth actually traveled across Canada and interviewed and met with regional biologists and ag extension people. And anyway, you can read, it's a free download if you want to just search the title. You can download this paper and read all the details of how we did it. But the short version is that these little red Rorschach blobs are level 9 watersheds. And watersheds make most sense because that's pigs sort of are closely associated with water and wetlands. And the level 9 matches conservatively with about the size of a home range. So each red blob there has had confirmed at least one wild pig confirmation in them. It's actually smaller than, but to be conservative, we went with level 9 to say, okay, that's about the size of home ranges. And we track them by watershed. We map them in other ways by, you can use artificial boundaries like rural municipalities, and we've done that. And having all of the data means, and GIS, we can easily sort of produce different kinds of maps. But this is, I think, by far the most useful and important. And then, you know, by 2010, when we actually, 2010 is when we formally started our own monitoring, and I started on wild pig research, but by then, of course, they were already fairly well established in some pockets. You know, northwest of Edmonton in Alberta is by far the big hot pocket. Must be thinking about lunch. Hot spot for wild pigs. And, you know, this does not account for densities. This is just presence absence only, just to simplify it for now. We can dig deeper into that, but suffices to say, just using presence absence, we're starting to see watersheds already. And certainly when I started in 2010, I sort of scanned the landscape and said, okay, what am I going to do with myself for the next 27 and a half years? This sort of was just simmering in the background, and it was really an open question. In 2010, many people said, no, there's no wild pigs free ranging in Saskatchewan. There's been a few escapes, but they'll never survive the Saskatchewan winter. And that's just, you know, that's just an old wives' tale or whatever. We started trail camera work, and literally our first objective was to say, you know, are there wild pigs free ranging on the prairies? Super basic, and very quickly found out indeed there are pigs on our trail cams, and they're at least established in some places. And then people said, well, yeah, sure, they're escapees, but again, they'll never survive. And so our next objective was to establish that indeed they were reproducing. And then, of course, we started to see females with litters, and indeed multiple litters, establishing this context of, you know, 6 young per litter, and multiple litters where mom would be walking with, you know, some 5 or 5-month-old or so pigs that are, you know, quite large size, and then some wee little striped little piglets that were probably a few days old, all in that same group walking together at night. And so clearly we had an issue here. And over time, it started to expand. And so Ruth's work for this particular mapping ended in 2017. And showed that already we have a lot of wild pigs. And this doesn't necessarily mean established, these are occurrences, and so that's an important point. So just because that watershed is red, it means that the pig was confirmed in that watershed. It could have been just a male traveling through. Unlikely that that's the case, given what we know now about the ecology, and having looked at a lot of GPS collar data, we don't think that's that common. Or but these was simply occurrences as the first cut. And indeed, this is the first and only mapping work ever done that I'm aware of, and certainly the first and only peer-reviewed work that's actually mapped out these pigs. I'm not aware of anybody else mapping in this way, or certainly not publishing these results. So we're kind of the only show in town in terms of mapping and having this level of data. And so I did, while Ruth was on mat leave, I did my basic attempt to keep up with the data, and indeed we saw more pigs in the last year in 2020 than we did in, I think, all of Ruth's work previously, just to emphasize that turn. And again, Ontario has done digging and asking questions and searching, and they've actually found something like 31 new sightings when they started to look. And so this is one of the funny things about species, is if you're not looking and nobody's asking or monitoring, maybe you're not seeing too much. But when you actually start looking hard, and indeed Saskatchewan was the same case, is we started to really ask a lot of people, and people were sharing, like, as I say, this database right here represents a little over 54,000 individual occurrences across all those data sets, including media searches. You know, there are lots of local newspapers love to run stories, often with photos of, you know, wild boar tore apart a cemetery in southwestern Manitoba, and they had photos of the damage. And so there's lots of media reports that are also useful. And we've used social media very effectively to get people to share those occurrences with us. Not all of them pan out. We did a massive national telephone survey a few years ago, and there was quite a lot of people said, yeah, they said, have you seen a wild pig in the wild in Canada in the last 3 years? But then we actually followed up with every single person that said yes and phoned them. And in a lot of those cases, they said, well, yeah, I saw it on my uncle's farm. Okay, well, that's inside a fence, so that doesn't count. Or, you know, so we actually have a multi-step process to evaluate these before we include them in our database. So we don't just take every sighting or any sort of rumor or whatever that comes around. We love rumors because they do often lead us down the path. but certainly doesn't just go into our database. So we have to verify. And of course, and again, it's not showing here, but in those watersheds where we start to get multiple occurrences over multiple years with, there's a spot in central Saskatchewan on the east side there where we probably in one watershed would easily have 800 plus trail camera photos from multiple people. And so, this is what we would often, if we were in a court of law, we'd be talking about a weight of evidence. And the weight of evidence now to support the presence and reproduction of pigs is quite overwhelming. And the weight of evidence and understanding density and the number of animals is not fantastic yet, but it's growing. Certainly, we definitely know that there are what we call a number of strongholds. I will say that of all of these data, 99% of all occurrences are actually in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba, so the 3 prairie provinces. There are a few in BC. I think we've had one in the last 2 years. Ontario has sort of just been digging and found some recent ones, but they're also acting on them. And those on the east side, or in Atlantic Canada, I should say, were, I think, one-offs, and I don't think they were established. So again, this is really so far a prairie Canada problem by far, but the potential for this, and sort of if you had a map like this that showed out of control forest fires, I think that's a good analogy, because in a lot of ways the thinking and the process and the sort of the way we respond probably is best aligned with forest firefighting rather than some of the more conventional tools that we use for understanding and managing wild mammals. And this is indeed completely out of control. As I say, BC, for whatever reason, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it was detailed or super, not a criticism, but they didn't do a lot. But it doesn't seem like things have taken off there. Ontario is sort of really active and have found them, but they don't really, I don't think there's a single trail camera photo from Ontario that I'm aware of with young. And so what they're saying, and I agree at this point, that there's no evidence of established populations, which is a key point here, and I will get to that. I just, for interest and related to our discussion today around the NWT specifically, and we haven't got there yet, but this is the building blocks of the story. And this is, if NWT is to be concerned about pigs, there's really 2 concerns. One is that they will move naturally, and another one is that they'll arrive in the back of a pickup truck or some other conveyance, probably not dropped from the sky by parachute, hopefully, but those are really the 2 risk factors. So I think looking at by ecozone is important. And originally, a lot of people said this was going to be a prairie ecosystem issue, and indeed, many people think of it as a prairie problem because it is in the prairie provinces. But in fact, I meant to look up the numbers again, and I forgot. I can't remember what the breakdown is between red and yellow, but there are a lot of pig sightings, possibly as much. It's probably pretty close to parity right now, of pig sightings in the boreal plains ecosystem as there is in the prairies. So that is definitely concerning. Certainly raises, and they are quite far north. But one thing you will notice, it doesn't show up as well in this map, but a lot of these sightings are closely tied to agriculture. So you look at that Peace River Valley in northern Alberta there, up close to the Bee in the boreal plains. That's ag in there still, and even right north of the Bee, there's a big chunk of ag there. And so one of the big burning questions in Canada that I have and don't have a good answer for yet, because we just don't have data, is how far north are these things going to move, and how successful? We know they're hugely successful in ag areas. There's a massive ag subsidy. There's trillions of calories out on the landscape in the middle of July. And these animals put on huge body condition. The biggest animal we've handled in Saskatchewan was 638 pounds. And so these animals are in prime physical condition. And we know for a fact that that drives reproduction, that you have larger females have more young, they have bigger young, and they survive better. That's just not even open for debate at this point. We know that in all sorts of ways. And so when they move into the boreal forest, this is not optimal habitat for them in the sense of calories, and pigs will queue into any kind of food. So in California, they're seeing pigs have learned that grapes have high sugar content and they're good food. And so they're jumping up on their hind legs and they're tearing grapes off the vine and causing all sorts of damage on grapes. In Texas, they seed peanut fields and they go down the row like a vacuum cleaner and with their nose in the ground, and they suck up each row and inhale all the peanuts that have been seeded, and they go back in the morning and they're all gone and have to reseed. Or in southern Manitoba, they hit corn. Corn is king in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, and pigs go crazy over corn as the highest quality. So they have this incredible ability beyond almost, I think, any other animal I know, to find the best food on the landscape and then just consume it in vast quantities. And so, but the boreal is clearly not the energy factory that the prairies are, and so, but yet they're clearly thriving. But a lot of these red dots, even though they're in the boreal plains, are actually closely tied to eggs. So a number of unknowns, but we also know that white-tailed deer are going, with number of how many sightings have we had now, white-tailed deer north of the Arctic Circle. And so while deer have the advantage of having this 4-chambered stomach, that can be a real benefit once you get away, especially away from ag. And these pigs are monogastrics with single stomach, like us. That may choose to be a more limiting factor. I think that when we should look at the existing research that's been done around the expansion of whitetails and give us some guidance about where we think pigs might go as well. So here's our most recent map of Canada with all the watersheds as I've shown. But this is work that, this is sort of hot off the presses, but one of the things I've also been doing is taking all the data we have around, so all the red, of course, is those occurrences, but blue is actually where we have confirmed reproduction. And so this is now more of what we would call an established population. And there are no formal criteria that I'm aware of to say, this is how you define an established population of pigs or other species for that matter. So my view and what we're sort of thinking and working through right now is this is time. So if you're seeing, for example, some of that big giant blue patch in the center of Saskatchewan, we have confirmed pig sightings every year for the last 20 years, and we have reproductive data of staggering proportions in that one blue patch. We easily have 1,000 photos of pigs, and certainly many hundreds of photos of pigs with piglets at heel, and so confirmed reproduction. So that would be very clearly established population. I would even call that a stronghold of wild pigs. And so that blue patch in Alberta, I would call that an established stronghold. And then that big blue patch in southwestern Manitoba. So I believe there's at least one, and in Saskatchewan, probably 2 really firmly established strongholds of pigs that are going to be exceedingly difficult to eradicate. But then these other occurrences, which are less clear as to what that means. But again, occurrences are really important and should not be ignored, because with pigs, initially I sort of felt like if you saw one, then it's almost proof of it's like rats on the farm. If you see one, you probably have a rat problem. If you see one in the middle of the day, you have a rat problem. You don't have one rat, you have lots. And so I think I've sort of been thinking that way with pigs, but we need to do better than just occurrences. And so that's certainly the big step forward I think we've made in the last year, is really trying to say, okay, let's do a deeper dive on this, and let's think of reproduction as another indicator of establishment beyond just mapping these occurrences. So here we are. I've only plotted the mainline NWT because I feel quite strongly and hope and feel reasonably confident in saying the islands, I think, are going to be pretty safe over the long term. Pigs are notoriously effective swimmers, but I do not believe they're going to swim that kind of ocean with those temperatures and do well by it. So or be running across the sea ice. So it's not necessarily absolute zero risk, but I think certainly at this point in 2021, I'm not prepared to include those in my risk analysis. And pretty clearly, if you look at the established pigs that we have in terms of natural movements, clearly that southern boundary is your #1 risk. And indeed, primarily, especially in Alberta, although there's a few sightings in BC, this map is a bit misleading in the sense that it almost looks like Ontario, or pardon me, BC and Alberta are sort of probably somewhat similar, in fact, really in terms of numbers and especially the very most recent stuff. Alberta is has far more pigs, no question, and probably more of a concern. But those northern occurrences are clearly our big focus, and given what we know from the collar data, these animals have home ranges that are more than 300 square kilometers in any season. They're highly mobile, so they can move large distances, but will they move far? And indeed, I think that the big success story so far for pigs not being knocking on the border is the lack of agriculture in that far northern BC and far northern Alberta. If there were big clumps of continuous or nearly continuous and roads connecting those, I would be much more concerned about that southern boundary of NWT. I think the boreal forest will probably act as somewhat of a buffer. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of the current scenario with pigs knocking on the door. And so what does that mean in terms of risk and impact? Well, one thing that I've looked at in quite some detail is caribou, and especially for two reasons, because caribou are a good indicator. They're really, really important culturally and ecologically. They're a cultural keystone species. They're an ecological keystone species. And they're also, because these, the green herds at least, are migratory, and from a disease perspective, pigs don't necessarily have to, pigs could be vectors that bring the disease to the doorstep and then infect caribou, and then something like chronic wasting disease springs to mind. The latest map I saw today of chronic wasting disease in Saskatchewan is truly alarming, and it is indeed spreading and continues to spread completely out of control. And so CWD is probably the #1 risk that I think of when it comes to caribou, and we know that in Europe it has spread to reindeer, and they've done massive efforts and huge removals to try and stop the spread of CWD. And so one of the concerns is, as I say, is pigs could bring that into the neighborhood, and then migratory caribou could carry it across the line into NWT. So in the green herds, you know, we have the Beverly Kamenierick and the Bathurst herds are the two that are actually migratory into Manitoba and Saskatchewan. We have a fair bit of distance there, but certainly highlight that as something that we need to think about. And then in the yellow are all the ranges of the boreal caribou. These are not migratory animals, and so are less likely to spread, although could spread, you know, basically hopscotching from non-migratory overlapping animals over a distance. Not a lot of overlap yet, but certainly if you look at Saskatchewan, that the southern boundary in what we call the SK1, that there is red, and indeed there's red even up into the SK2 right along the Manitoba border. Not a lot, but there's overlap with several herds there, and certainly cause for concern. So, you know, like a 1% overlap with caribou boreal range, so not necessarily big giant alarm bells, but the potential is really there. And when we have CWD spreading completely out of control, and we have wild pigs that are on the Canadian prairies are effectively spreading completely out of control, Alberta has a control strategy in place. Alberta has been quite proactive, and so that is one of the probably the biggest pieces of good news for the NWT, is that Alberta has been doing really good. Ontario has been quite proactive, despite the fact that they don't really have an established problem per se, but they're monitoring, they're out there, they're doing all sorts of good things. And so that's the good news story. The bad news is that Manitoba and Saskatchewan do not have a strategy that I'm aware of any kind. And pigs in Saskatchewan, so 53% of all sightings are in Saskatchewan, and 32%, I should know this, yeah, 32% are in Manitoba. So again, the overwhelming majority is Saskatchewan, but Saskatchewan and Manitoba are the concentrated big players in this. Neither of them have control plans of any kind that I'm aware of sort of formally in place. Manitoba isn't doing any like the government, I don't think is doing any killing of any kind. And so that is very concerning, and that's why we see these huge red areas, and we can and should expect those red areas to expand. And you know, we just keep getting sightings and occurrences of all sorts almost every single day. So lots of reasons to say right now today, is it, you know, are we seeing CWD spreading to deer? and then up through Caribou directly. Probably relatively low risk, but what these maps are going to look like 10 years from now, if we just continue on this sort of, I don't know what to even call it, but certainly lack of real effort here. I think that's where I lose sleep at night, and that's where I've gathered a number of gray hairs over the last 10 years, is just sort of tracking this spread and spread and spread. And again, I sort of I tweeted today that, Saskatchewan is celebrating 21 years with no strategy for CWD. And so CWD is now considered endemic to Saskatchewan. That was noted in this latest release of the map, and it's just spread all across the province. And so CWD spreads completely out of control I'm not aware, there's no management strategy, and I'm not really aware of a whole lot of anything going on to control it. There is no CWD ever detected in Manitoba, amazingly, but I suspect that's only a matter of time, given Saskatchewan has been very generous in sharing its pigs and disease and other things, and I think that's just going to continue to spread into Alberta and so forth. So a number of things I think to be concerned about, and again, I don't want to overplay this as an issue today, but it's one of those things that I think has the real potential to get very serious very fast. And so I won't go through all of this, but just highlighted the different herds and the overlap of green as barren ground, and eastern migratory, or the Cape Churchill herd there, and then the boreal caribou, and indeed some very minimal overlap with mountain caribou, but something to be aware of. So that's sort of some analysis there, some sort of a tight, short analysis summary of what we've looked at in terms of caribou. In terms of habitat, this is one of their signature problems, arguably the number one issue, especially in places where agriculture is king. Crop damage is number one, but in terms of environmental issues, because these elk, deer, moose are browsing on shrubs, elk and deer are grazing primarily on grasses, and to some degree browsing as well. They can have some impacts, but these pigs, this is one evening, a large group of pigs came in to this grassland and just tear it apart. Their nose gets in the ground and they just rip it up, and they're feeding on roots and insect larvae here. And obviously the recovery from this is much different than from, even say 100 elk came and fed over a period of a week. They might graze it down quite far, but they're not doing this kind of widespread destruction. They get into wetlands and they wallow around and they make a mess. They urinate and defecate, and E. coli, salmonella sort of disease issues, and just very, very intensive, hugely destructive to the landscape. And of course, in terms of just not just in open areas, but in wetlands, they're incredibly destructive. They contaminate water supplies, and in forested areas, we've seen understory just decimated as well. Predation does occur from, I know of someone who saw wild pigs chase down and take down an adult white-tailed deer, certainly fawns and calves of ungulates. They will feed on all sorts of things. Any ground nesting birds are hugely at risk, and so right now, nesting birds are just getting hammered by pigs, eating the eggs, eating the young, catching the adults on nests, and just devastating. One area in southeastern Saskatchewan called Moose Mountain, the local hunters were really, they wanted the pigs around, they were keen on them, and they were really sort of against eradication until they had a total failure that year, or near total failure of their waterfowl crop. There were no goslings, no ducklings, no upland game bird young seen, and it was really, really destructive. So their impact on salamanders, frogs, insect populations. When I was in Texas, we were catching pigs in an area of very, very high density. And what was most striking to me is not only could you hear and see pigs everywhere, but you didn't hear insects, you didn't see deer, you didn't see, well, you saw nothing. You saw pigs and a torn up, ruined, devastated landscape. And I think everybody should have to see that and experience that just to go. And I admit, I've studied pigs for a long time. I didn't totally get it until I was standing in this soundless landscape without insects and birds chirping. And I mean, it was really quite striking how devastating those pigs were to that. They were actually on a gigantic military base, but it was just devastating. I won't go into the details of stats of this, but basically this is some work we did using our trail camera data to show what species are closely associated and use the same kind of habitats, and those that tend to avoid each other. And so wild pigs and moose are actually are my #1 concern for impacts, and of course wetlands. Wild pigs, wetlands, and moose all co-occur in this particular study area. And in fact, habitat damage, disease, and even potentially moose are pretty notorious for protecting their young. So predation, maybe not too much, but certainly habitat damage and destruction of these wetlands and contamination is a concern. Mule deer are on the other end of the spectrum at the top of that graph, and so are the least overlapping with pigs. But small mustelids do, coyotes are fairly close. You know, there's others that are on that spectrum as well. And this is more on this is right on the forest fringe, but it does have ag involved as well. And so when we get away from these ag systems, it'll change, but certainly overlap and competition is a concern. And you know, I already touched on CWD, but here's our map, and this is it needs some updating. But suffices to say that, you know, the gray area on the Canadian prairies there, and it's so interesting that it's knocking on Manitoba's door. And I think BC has had a couple of, Montana's had a couple recently, and I don't know if BC has had. I can't remember, to be honest. But anyway, it's just spreading so fast it's hard to keep up. But that is the #1 disease on my radar in terms of concern. It's still quite a way. There hasn't been any cases detected in the far north, but I don't think sampling has been particularly high in the far north either. And caribou and those white-tailed deer established as those, there has been no testing of wild pigs of any kind, so we have no idea. We know they can become infected. We also know that pigs feed on carcasses a lot, and will feed on ungulates. And so in some ways they may be the biggest risk for CWD because of that scavenging and that strong interest in ungulate carcasses. And they may, it's potential that they could transmit the disease into the soil through their fecals without being infected. So it's a big unknown, but it's also something that there's a lot of pieces of evidence saying, wow, we need to be concerned here. I use this map on purpose because this is a map of all the watersheds where wild pigs have been eradicated as of May 2021 in Canada, and as you can see, there are none. And so if anybody tries to paint this as a success story, or that there has been a lot of good work and there have been good people working really, really hard on this, especially in the last year and a half, 2 years, I've really seen a big change. And you literally in the early days, I couldn't get anybody to return my phone calls, or like getting interest in this was like in 2010, 2011, 2012, like nobody gave a shit. Like fundamentally, it was like being, I do understand what it must be like to be radioactive, because I think I was for a while. That's changed a lot, and there are more people interested, but I do this. I think it's really important to acknowledge that I'm not aware of any eradication that's been done. And certainly on the Canadian prairies, this notion of eradication has faded dramatically. Saskatchewan will not eradicate. It is my expert opinion, and we have a lot of data to back it up, that we are in the pig business for the duration now. There may be areas where we can, partial areas where we can eradicate. I think NWT is pig-free. I will say the Yukon had a couple of escapes and did not by any stretch do a good job of managing those escapes. And almost wrote a book on what not to do in all sorts of ways, and it was pretty bad a few years ago. I haven't heard anything since, and there's no evidence that anything became established, so there is that. But you know, escapees have been dealt with, but in terms of eradicating free-ranging populations, there is just none. And so, you know, I wish I had a better story to tell, but I'm here to present the facts and just the facts. So that's a bit of a quick overview of some of the work that we've done. And as usual, I've gone a little longer than I wanted to, added more points I've had to say, but I will stop there, and certainly want to acknowledge a bunch of support that we've had. The overwhelming majority of this is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Although more recently the government of NWT, I need to add this because they've supported some of our work too. Apologize for that. I just realized I missed that one. But really, for the overwhelming majority of this talk would have been about a minute and a half long if it hadn't been for the USDA paying for callers and students and cameras and all sorts of this. But U of S has been a huge supporter, and certainly some other in-kind and support from some other agencies. So I'm going to stop talking there, but more than happy to take questions. I believe, I think you're supposed to type them in the chat, and they're going to, Johanna will read them out to me. So I thank you for your attention and time, and feel free to fire away. And if for some reason we're out of time, just shoot me an email, or I'm happy to have a chat with folks anytime. Any questions online there?
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan, for that great presentation. Folks are now welcome to enter their questions into the question and answer box, and yes, I will look over them and get them to Ryan. So the first question here, I think, came in a bit earlier, and you did touch on this already, but maybe just to reiterate, it says, does chronic wasting disease impact wild pigs?
Yeah, we have no idea. But there has been no work done on that yet. Where CWD is most prominent in the US is there isn't actually, for the most part, that many pigs there yet. Like Colorado actually eradicated their wild pigs. And so there's been a couple of good success stories there. We just have no idea. So I really want to emphasize that this is, again, thinking about sort of weight of evidence, there are pieces of evidence that are lining up in terms of distribution and abundance and the ecology of these pigs that, they see in this photo here. They congregate, they're super social, they feed on carcasses, so they're interacting with dead ungulates. There are a lot of red flags going up here, but at the end of right now, we don't know. We do know there have been, with domestic pigs, the same species, Suscrofa, we do know that they can become infected with CWD. That's the only piece of really solid evidence we have. So the answer is we don't know yet, but we bloody well should be thinking about it. Thinking about it.
Great. So we've got another question here. Someone asked, any thoughts on wolf-wild pig interactions? Would wolves be a force in their control?
That's an excellent question. We do know in their native range in Europe, so Italy, wolves are major predators, or they feed quite a lot on wild boar. And so there's one case in Saskatchewan of somebody that's super trustworthy, and I have no reason to question them. They've trapped and killed more pigs than I've had hot meals. And this person saw once a wolf take down a wild pig. And there have been a few cases. On the Canadian prairies, we just don't have predators, and so that distribution right now is mostly in areas with ag, and everywhere we have ag, there's been a general policy for 100+ years to shoot predators on site, so we don't have the biggest predator we have is a coyote, which is unlikely to be effective against pigs. And so the answer is we don't really know, but we know they can be predators. And where they and so one of the things we're looking at is this idea of predators as providing another ecosystem service of keeping pigs out. And so we may not see pigs move beyond the current distribution northward because of black bears and in areas where there are grizzlies to the west, and indeed wolves is perhaps the most effective predator. So they may play a role. The problem with pigs is they have razor sharp tusks, they can be huge, and these big groups are super crazy aggressive. If you go on YouTube and look up wild pig charge or wild boar charge or wild pig charge, hunters shoot one of these animals and they turn and they run at it and try and kill the shooter. There's video of a guy in a tree where pigs are chasing his dog relentlessly and incredibly aggressively. And so I'm not convinced that predators are going to play a massive role. When you see a group of this size, we've seen groups where I've done the math and the group weighs more than an F-150 pickup truck. And so I don't think we want to downplay, and they look kind of passive and they're kind of snorting and rolling the mud here, but I have seen them they go from passive to aggressive in a snap of a finger. When we first started this, we went to a wild boar farm, and these are domestic animals, have always been domestic for perhaps hundreds of years. And the guy said, oh yeah, come inside. They're totally passive, and we're standing in there. I'm taking pictures. I'm seeing these wild boar, which I'd never really interacted with. And he said, oh, by the way, if you pick up a piglet, you'll be dead in less than 30 seconds. Every pig in this, you pick up a piglet, the piglet will squeal, and every pig in this fence will be on top of you immediately. He's like, yeah, I should have mentioned that earlier. Yeah, no shit. I'm not convinced that wolves are going to, and Montana said the same thing. I've helped Montana for years with their stuff. And they're like, yeah, we have grizzlies. I'm like, what's your biggest grizzly? Oh, 475 pounds. I'm like, our biggest pig is 638 pounds and has 2 giant Ginsu knives on its face. So no, I think it's an interesting question. I'm just not convinced that's going to be the solution for us.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a few more minutes left. So one more question here that I know sort of the answer to, but can you touch on, is hunting the primary methodology used to eradicate wild pig populations?
It's an excellent question, and intuitively it seems good, and I know a lot of governments have leaned on it. The Prairie provinces all declared open season. Unfortunately, that, in fact, in Saskatchewan, has been, in my expert opinion, has been one of the major factors that has helped to spread them across the prairie landscape. Because you look at this group here in this wallow, in this photo, and you go and shoot, and hunters, usually at best will kill 2 or 3 of these and then they're gone. And so they break up groups and spread them around the landscape, and they also create a fear. And so this is a trail cam photo, obviously during the day, but in areas where hunting becomes established, animals become highly nocturnal. And in heavy pressured areas, you won't even see them at dawn and dusk, like in the 2 to 4 a.m. in total darkness. And so they become nocturnal, and then they become really hard to find. And so the worst thing for a government operation that's using ground traps, which is kind of the major tool in Canada that everybody's jumped on, are these big panel traps. If you try and set those up and run them after lots of sport hunting, your success is way, way low. And so where you see success in the US at eradicating pigs, the first thing they do is ban sport hunting. And certainly any management plan that includes allowing non-experts to remove pigs, I think, is a recipe for disaster. That the only way is whole sounder removal. So you see, how many pigs do we see here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, say 15, probably some more off screen. Just call it even 15. If you go in to remove those and take anything less than 15, we would consider that a total waste of time and energy. And in fact, has contributed to the problem, because those animals that survived will be trap shy, they'll be more nocturnal, they'll be in heavier cover. And so the worst possible thing you can have is sport hunting or have any non-experts. And that was, Ontario just released their draft strategy, and that was sort of my major comment, was that any effort to allow anybody else to kill pigs other than, with aircraft support and trained experts is going to get you into a whole world of trouble and spread the problem. So sport hunting is the worst thing you can do, unfortunately, which is counterintuitive, but absolutely true.
Yeah. Okay, we've got lots of great questions coming in, and I don't think we'll actually have time for them all. So I hope that everyone can, you can shoot Ryan an email or me after the presentation if you have more questions. I'll ask one more, I think, before we wrap up here. So someone asked, we always get questions about how many of species X. You shared the last firm numbers of wild pigs in us from 500 farms and 32,000 animals in 2001. What could be the best guesstimate now? We are used to guesstimates in the NWT.
Those numbers, to be super clear, were for domestic animals on farm inside a fence. And so because of the census, we have good data on that. We do not have good estimates of populations. So I would argue that our biggest and most important and by far our most defensible product in 11 years has been those maps. Those are our best indicator. I would argue nationally, it's the only national data set we have for Canada that of anything pigs, basically, or in terms of wild pigs. In terms of numbers, I don't have good estimates, and I'm not as a scientist, I use the word guesstimate with my family, but it actually gives me the willies a little bit. Especially because I know from experience that if people make estimates, they change from guesstimates to fact in less than 24 hours. So I have literally refused the last 27,000 times people have asked me to guess how many pigs. I say I don't know, and I'm not willing to guess. It's also really hard because they're so elusive, and so, you know, NWT and every other jurisdiction in Canada flies aerial surveys to moose and caribou and does a really good job, but pigs are so elusive. They also spend a lot of time under the snow and under the dirt. And so they might be wallowing around in this mud and covered in mud, or they might be sleeping under the nearest spruce tree. And so counting them from the air is just, I've flown well over 1,000 hours in small planes spotting wildlife, and I've seen lots and lots of animals, but pigs are the hardest to spot. So we don't know, and we shouldn't be guessing. I have said many times that Saskatchewan is well on track to have more pigs than people, and I do believe that, but that's just as a very broad, with no timeline and no specific. But I think that when you get on that exponential curve, which we're on now, that numbers are we're clearly in the thousands of animals. There's no question. I mean, Alberta, briefly for a few years, had a bounty program, and they killed about 1,100 animals just through that program alone. And we know that people with guns are hugely inefficient at finding pigs. You know, 1 or 2 hunters at best, you're probably getting about 28, 29% success rate. And I will say, of all the collared pigs that we had in Saskatchewan with all the hunting, I think we lost 3 animals to sport hunters in all those years, 4 years with 30 some odd animals. So hunting is very, very low. And so, no, I won't hazard a guess, but the numbers have exploded for sure especially in the last 3 years. The only real way forward is trail cameras, a properly executed network of trail cameras. And I've sort of been working on that, but again, I mean, I just can't get really any interest or much in the way of interest in the prairies to do work on this. And so without the USGA, we wouldn't have done much at all. But trail cams are the path forward to give some estimates. So it's something that's on my to-do list, but I'm fully unprepared to guess. Certainly in the most northern parts of all of the provinces, densities are low. Well, I should say that the core is right on the forest fringe of Saskatchewan, and as I say, there's a circle to be drawn there around that Milford, Tillsdale area, where I would guesstimate there's probably about as many pigs in that circle as the rest of Canada combined. When you get into northern Alberta and into the boreal forest, there's only a fraction of occurrences. So sorry, I can't. It's the most frequent question I get. I wish we had the resources to do a full-blown estimate, and it should be something that gets done. It is a key indicator. That map is also our best baseline to address success or failure going forward, and unfortunately, so far, it has not tracked any success of any kind, but has indeed tracked progression. But population estimates and these maps, those two together should be the key baseline to measure any efforts against, but we're not there yet.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ryan. It's a few minutes after 1, so I'll have to wrap things up, but thank you so much for the presentation, and also thank you to everyone who joined us for this webinar. If you'd like to join us for more great webinars later this week, please find more information on our website. That's nwtcispp.ca, or find us on Facebook by searching for NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens. But thank you again, Dr. Ryan Brook, for the great presentation, and please take care.
Thanks so much. And I just put up my contact info again. If anybody wants to reach out, feel free to fire me email, and always happy to talk about pigs. So take care, everyone. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, take care.